Hi, fantasy readers. This is Corinne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today, you get 2 stories for the price of 1, which is still free because this is a free podcast. But still, it's a great deal. One story is about a brave and reckless boy dealing with monsters, and the other is about a brave and reckless girl dealing with dragons. Both stories are written by Elizabeth Klein, who was actually a reader recommendation. She was already on my radar, so when I saw she put out an anthology with short stories, I snatched it up. Elizabeth grew up in a small village in New South Wales, Australia. She trained as a teacher and taught for almost 30 years. She and her husband now travel in a caravan full-time, and she has over 70 published works. Today's narrator is Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end, or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from both the author and the narrator. For now, please enjoy The Monster Catcher by Elizabeth Klein.
The people of Grimm waited all winter for the monster catcher to arrive. The menfolk needed his expertise because overnight their tools grew blunt in their sheds or vanished altogether, for which they had no answers. The women expected him to locate the gremlins that stole socks from their laundry baskets. Relief would come to all the girls and boys who had endured long and frightening months with monsters lurking under their beds each night. Many had slept with softball bats, just in case. Everyone looked forward to his coming, and yet everyone feared him too. The reason for that was because someone in Grimm always dropped dead when the monster catcher came. It had been a long, wild, unpredictable year in which a deadly virus had struck Grimm and therefore cancelled all the town's festivities, including Halloween. Parents had to learn how to homeschool their children, something in which they were ill-equipped. Shopping at the local supermarket meant wearing masks and trying hard not to cough or sneeze on one another. The monster catcher came late in the afternoon, and those who saw him walking along their street trembled. They'd sneak a peek from behind curtains and corners and prayed under their breath they wouldn't be the ones who dropped dead. The first to spot him was Tom Flannery as he pitched a fine cricket ball to his friend George Riddle. The sound of a loud crack followed as George struck it and ran to the opposite wicket, blonde hair wild in the blustery wind. The stranger caught the cricket ball in his free hand. He had to reach out, straightening his arm to catch it, and Tom, surprised by the fine catch, suddenly froze. George spun around and stared at the man holding the ball with suspicion, but then recognition registered on his face too. His blue eyes grew wide like saucers, his face white like his mother's petunias. The cricket bat he was holding fell from his hands into the dust. The stranger was dressed in a smart black suit with a black hat on his head. His tanned face looked youthful despite his thick gray hair. He held a black suitcase in his other hand. In fact, everything about him, except his hair, was black. "Hello, boys," called the stranger, oblivious to the reaction his presence caused. "You play cricket well." Neither boy acknowledged his praise. The man tossed the ball to George. "You brothers?" Tom shook his head. "Just friends." "Just friends, eh? Know who I am?" he asked, stepping closer. "Yeah," Tom said, shielding his eyes with his hand. "Pa says you're the monster catcher." "That's right, son," the man said, and placed his suitcase down on the grass as if he meant to engage them in conversation for a while. Tom swallowed a lump that got snagged in his throat. His mouth dried up like the creek out the back of his house during the last drought. He'd never spoken to the monster catcher before. The man wiped his brow with a hanky from his back pocket. "I was wondering if either of you had heard of any unusual activity in Grimm this past year." Tom didn't want to mention the strange fairy ring that had sprung up overnight on their back lawn, hadn't even mentioned it to George. It was a perfect circle of pale toadstools with wide-brimmed caps. Maybe that really wasn't all that unusual. He bit his tongue and said nothing. George just shook his head and shrugged. "No matter," said the man, and glanced toward the street where lights started to glimmer and the sound of faint voices of people in their houses as they returned home from work. The monster catcher opened his suitcase, reached in and pulled out 2 small satchels, each tied at the neck with a thin gold string. He held them out for the boys to take. "This is to keep the bogeyman away. Don't put it away in your drawers, but keep it next to your beds. The bogeyman don't like the smell." Despite never hearing of any bogeyman in Grimm, Tom took one of the bags and noticed a gold image of a mirror on it with tiny, intricate curlicues around its frame. "What's that on it?" he asked. "Oh, the mirror?" said the monster catcher with casual interest. "Catching monsters is all about mirrors. Don't you boys know all mirrors are magical in some way?" "No," George said. "How are they magical?" "How, you ask?" said the man. "Well, what happened to the mirror in Snow White? No one knows where it went. What if it's still around somewhere? Ever thought of that?" Tom never thought about fairy tales. He was a boy, after all. "Remember it belonged to the evil stepmother? Well, what did she do with it? And what about the mirror in Beauty and the Beast that allowed her to visit it nightly? Pretty amazing, eh? But what happened to it? Where did it get to? Let's not forget the mirror in Alice and the Looking Glass, which allowed Alice into her dream world. That was pretty awesome, too. What happened to that mirror? And have you heard of the magic mirror of Matsuyama, which allowed her to believe her dead mother was always with her?" Tom frowned and shook his head. "Never heard that one before." George, wide-eyed, stared at him. "Well, I guess you boys don't know the power of mirrors, for good or evil purposes. But they're very real and oh, so cunning as they hide their powers from us." "Are our mirrors magical?" George asked. "Absolutely," the monster catcher assured him as George smelled the nefarious contents of the satchel. The stinking herbs inside made him grimace. Tom made a face when he sniffed his, too. "That stinks." The monster catcher grinned and picked up his suitcase. "There's no perfume in repellents, son, but they work like a treat against dark creatures that wish you harm. Their sense of smell is much sharper than yours or mine, and they'd smell it a mile away. It means they'll leave you alone. Don't you want to be safe when you sleep?" George smelled it again, and his face contorted. "Is it free, mister?" "Sure," said the monster catcher. He then tipped his hat to the boys. "Well, best be off. Might see you boys later tonight." "Please, please don't come to our house," Tom's mind hissed. The boys watched as he continued down the street with his steady, unhurried stride. The wind gusted around the oval and shifted more of the sand and dead leaves around. Afternoon shadows looked more like clawed hands inching closer to where they stood. Tom shivered, and George licked his dry lips. Neither seemed to want to continue their game of cricket. "You think all that stuff he said about mirrors being magical is true?" George asked Tom. "Nah," he answered. "There's no such thing as magical mirrors. He was talking about fairy tales, and they're just stories." "But when a mirror breaks, don't you have 7 years of bad luck? Isn't that what happened to Ben Hillier? Ma told me he smashed his mirror in a rage one day when he was drunk. Then his tractor blew up, his crops blighted, someone robbed his pigs, and then his farm burnt down and his wife left." "Just superstition," Tom assured his friend, though he'd also heard those stories about Ben Hillier. The back of his scalp prickled. "Don't go believing in that stuff or you'll make it happen." George swallowed. "You had anything unusual happen over at your place lately?" Tom shook his head. He squinted at his friend. "You?" "Nah." "That's good, isn't it? That monster catcher doesn't have to come calling at our houses then. We're safe." His grumbling stomach reminded him to hurry home for his dinner in case the monster catcher came calling early. George, pulling up the wicket, had similar thoughts. Orange and amber streaked the dusky sky, and a warm autumn wind rustled the leaves on the oval. "Come on, light's gone. Race you home." Both boys slapped palms, monster catcher momentarily forgotten, then raced in the direction of their houses at opposite ends of the street. Both palms slapped the traffic sign. Both boys laughed, breathless, then took off for home in opposite directions. Tom guessed it was a tie, as both were swift runners in races at school. He slapped the front door about the time George did, threw it open, and hurried into the kitchen to locate his mother. His father wouldn't be home yet from the foundry. "Monster catcher's in town," he called. The peeler in his mother's hand clattered on the kitchen sink. She turned to look at him, suddenly white as the new paint on the fence. "Where, Tom? Where did you see him?" He sat on one of the kitchen chairs. "He just spoke with George and me at the Oval. Then he was heading here, to town." He fished for the satchel in his pocket and placed it on the table. "Gave us both one of these to keep the bogeyman away." His mother picked it up and stared at it for a few seconds, then sniffed it and threw it in the bin. "Hey!" Tom called. "What did he say?" His mother interrupted. "Tell me." "Just a lot of stuff about fairy tales and mirrors. Said they were all magical." He grinned. "As if." "You didn't happen to mention the fairy ring, did you?" She looked at Tom intensely, as if his answer meant life or death. "No. Is it still there?" With a ragged sigh, his mother slumped in the chair opposite and nodded. "Best not to say anything about it, if he calls, that is." She glanced at the wall clock and chewed her bottom lip. "Your father's normally home by now. Where could he be?" Just then, a loud knock at the front door made his mother gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tom noticed how it trembled. He couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. The monster catcher seemed like a normal sort of man, maybe a bit eccentric, but nobody to fear. His mother rose and hurried to answer the door. Tom held his breath, but he could tell it was the monster catcher by the way his mother spoke. He stood up, pushed the chair under the table, and waited for them to appear. He couldn't understand why his heart pounded so fast all of a sudden, and his hands felt clammy. "Guess that's a natural reaction when the monster catcher comes calling." "Ah, we meet again, Tom Flannery," the monster catcher said, and smiled at him when he entered the kitchen. He removed his hat and placed it on his suitcase by the door. "Hello, sir," Tom said. His tongue flicked out to wet his top lip. "We don't have any unusual activity here." "Ah," the man said, and tapped the side of his nose with his right forefinger. "But I believe you're wrong, son. I sniffed out some strong vibes all over you earlier." "How?" his mother asked, her voice weak. "What kind of unusual activity?" The man smiled at her. "Monster disturbance out the back. Do you happen to have a fairy ring on your back lawn?" "Yes, but—" His mother started, looking at him aghast. "My good lady, it's a perfect magnet for fey creatures. Once they've zeroed in on a place, it's difficult to extract them. Rather like going to the dentist and telling him you have nothing wrong, when in fact he has to remove one of your teeth which is rotten at the roots." "Oh dear, then how can we get rid of them?" his mother asked, looking beside herself with worry. "Good lady, let me deal with them, as they can be downright dangerous," the monster catcher said in a solemn voice. "Lead me to the fairy ring, and remain here while I work." "But—" His mother shot Tom a dark look, and he clamped his mouth shut. "But that would be so much fun to watch," he wanted to say. The monster catcher followed his mother, and a few minutes later, she returned and sat down at the kitchen table once more. Tom sat with her, but he was itching to see how the monster catcher operated. But there was no way his mother would allow it. He had a plan. "Need the bathroom," he told his mother. "All right, but don't go near him. Come straight back." She eyed him as if she had read his mind. He nodded, hurried down the hall, and shut the bathroom door loud enough for her to hear. The monster catcher's suitcase stood near the back door now. Its lid was open. Tom crept nearer and took a peek inside. Lots of little satchels like the one he and George had received were inside. He stole to the back door and positioned himself behind the back window. Slowly, he pulled back the curtain so he could see what was happening outside. The monster catcher knelt on the grass and held what appeared to be a small hand mirror aimed at the fairy ring. Tom froze and covered his mouth from screaming as monstrous creatures shot out of the center of the ring into the mirror like some bizarre extraction ritual. Large, hairy, black things he had no name for, as well as smaller, scrabbling things, all trying to resist the pull of the magic mirror. They writhed and stretched like licorice until they squeezed their elongated bodies into the mirror with a swift whoosh. Tom stared in frozen fascination. Then the magic of the mirror blinked out with a flash of bright light. Quiet darkness descended once more on the backyard. Tom exhaled the breath he'd held and sagged against the wall. From his vantage point, he could see the monster catcher place the mirror inside a low, wooden case and close its lid. Then he picked it up and rose to his feet as if to come back inside the house again. Tom hastened back to the kitchen and sat on a chair moments before the monster catcher appeared with a huge smile on his face. Tom noticed he had left his suitcase and hat near the door in the dining room. "Well, I think all of your monster problems are taken care of, sweet lady," he said, and pulled a chair out from under the table as if to sit down. Tom's mother stared at him with wide-eyed terror. She wrung her hands on the apron tied about her waist. "May I trouble you for a cup of tea for my trouble?" he asked. Tom's mother jumped to her feet. "Sorry for my rudeness in not offering you anything." She filled the kettle with water and clattered with cups and saucers from the sideboard. Her hands trembled. "That's all right," he said. "No need to stress." "I've got homework to finish," said Tom. "Off you go then," his mother said, and waved her hand. Tom left the two adults to talk about monsters, but he wanted to see those monsters he'd extracted from the fairy ring for himself. Instead of heading to his bedroom, he redirected his steps toward the man's suitcase, keeping one eye on the kitchen. His mother was offering him a sweet biscuit with his tea. All her attention was on the monster catcher. Good. The suitcase appeared somewhat shabby that close. Tom noticed how some of the black surface of the case had worn away. He knew if he wanted to peek at the magic mirror, he needed to open one catch at a time, placing a finger on the part that flicked up so it wouldn't be heard. Once he started, he was surprised at how quiet the suitcase was to open. Soon he was looking at the low box which housed the mirror. "Here goes." He flicked open the lid as quietly as he dared, keeping an eye in the direction of the kitchen. There, on a black velvet cloth, lay a small mirror with an opalescent handle and back. The actual mirror lay face down. What would happen if he took a quick look? His hand reached out and picked up the mirror. Turning it over, he noticed not his own reflection, but a cloud-like haze swirling about in its depths. Then the horror began. It started with a tingling in his fingers, hands, and his arms. The mirror fell from his nerveless fingers. Next moment, they were stretching out before his shocked eyes like elastic, thinner and longer. The mirror was pulling him inside. A scream wrenched from his throat as he tried to resist, but it was too strong. Howls and shrieks came from within the opaque glass, and clawed hands sought his. They scratched and bit his arms till a scream was torn from the depths of his being. Tom was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. A strong hand grabbed the back of his jacket, and something black fell across the mirror's surface. Tom found himself lying on his back on the dining room floor. A concerned monster catcher stared into his face, clicking his fingers in front of Tom's eyes. His mother stood there, eyes red from sobbing. "Tom, are you all right?" asked the monster catcher. Tom nodded and sat up. "What happened?" "You did something very foolish that could have cost you your life," he said. "If I had been any later, you would have been inside the mirror along with all the monsters. Remember I told you about magical mirrors? They're all dangerous." Tom nodded and clambered to his feet. He noticed the mirror was back in its case, and the suitcase was shut again. His mother dabbed at her wet eyes with a crumpled hanky. "Why do you always have to look?" she scolded. The monster catcher answered for him. "You mustn't blame your son for being curious. There's no harm done. This time. So that's how you catch the monsters? Tom asked, feeling a little woozy. Now you know my secret. The man winked and gathered his hat and suitcase. He tipped his hat to Tom's mother. Well, best be off. Tom will be all right, just needs his dinner. Tom's mother cast a swift look at the wall clock. Tom knew she was worried about his father, who should have been home well before 5. It was now 6 o'clock. He stopped himself from thinking the worst as he trailed behind the monster catcher as he walked to the front door. His mother let him out, and he wandered away down the street. He'd have other houses to visit to ply his strange craft. They stood on the porch and stared in the direction of his father's work, almost willing to see him walking home. He's not dead, Mum, Tom muttered. His mother turned and disappeared inside, leaving him to his silent vigil. Street lights glimmered, and he could see people through their windows, hear faint voices on the wind, and in the distance, a lone figure approached. Tom stared. He was always glad to see his father, who was filthy from his day at the foundry, but his eyes were bright when he came through the front door. Far off, Tom could see him smiling. "He's here, Mum!" he yelled, then leaped from the porch and raced towards him. That night, as his family gathered for dinner, Tom's heart swelled with love for them. A strange gratefulness overcame him, and he felt as light as a soap bubble rising in the air. Not even the odd thinness and length of his hands and fingers seemed to matter.
I hope you enjoyed listening to The Monster Catcher by Elizabeth Klein, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. But don't forget, we have a double feature, and this next story even has a bit of a Christmas vibe as we transition into the holiday season. Please enjoy Dragon Knights by Elizabeth Klein.
As darkness spread its sable cloak upon the world and creatures slumbered in their nests and dens, rocks began to tumble down the slope of the mountain, the sound echoing across the valley. People in the nearby village pondered whether it was an earthquake, but old Miriam, who had seen 90 winters, drew her shawl closer about her thin shoulders and shook her gray head. She stood on her veranda and peered up at the trail of pale smoke descending from the crags. She held her breath. "Nay," she muttered to herself, her pale blue eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "No quake be that, but the beast that lives in caverns dark. It has woken at last." She curled her bottom lip up into her dry mouth and chewed as worry overcame her, since her granddaughter hadn't yet returned from the neighboring village. "Where be that girl? Where be Lilith?" Through his waking consciousness flashed images of the village in the clearing. There, in times past, he had walked in his human skin so he could listen to the villagers sing their Christmas hymns in the open square. Young children had skated on the frozen pond, and men hauled logs to their homes to heat their hearths. Yes, he enjoyed waking at this time of year. Hearts were full of expectation and hope, yet oblivious to perils at their door. He smelled the icy air, sweet with adventure, as it enticed him outside to stand on the craggy slopes. Magic had suspended time, and this gap in its fabric brought a change to the world at large, but not enough to perturb him. Yet he sensed it as he sensed the chill in the air. His emergence caused great boulders to roll down the slope with a shuddering avalanche, colliding with pines at the foot of the mountain. He was certain the folk in the village would hear the echoes in the still night. Indeed, let them tremble. Smoke from his flaring nostrils billowed in great waves, and then he belched flames to clear his throat and lungs. Ah, that felt good. He cast wide the tendrils of his magic, taking in the vast area of his domain, the mountain, forest, and lands beyond. He sensed power coursing through his body and through the iron muscles of his powerful limbs. His leafy green eyes turned steely gray as he remembered the abundant prey in the villages and hamlets, where folk relegated tales of flying serpents to fables. Humans were so fickle, their memories short-lived. They forgot the years of terror he had unleashed upon them in days of old. Now, upon waking, hunger gnawed at his cavernous belly and thirst parched his throat. He recalled a small stream at the foot of the mountain where he had once quenched his fiery thirst. That's where he needed to go. After he stretched his leathery wings, he took to the sky. He flew for a good measure of time, scouring the lay of the land before he descended through a clearing to the forest floor. A footpath meandered through the trees like a pale ribbon. Perhaps he should alter his appearance, in case someone happened upon him. His great size shrank as he took the form of a young man. Then he applied the magic to fashion clothes for himself to trick any human he came across, since he was very hungry. It was not long before he caught the sound of someone whistling up ahead. He decided to wait for him. In the moonlight, he spotted a young hunter with his unstrung bow and quiver of arrows slung across his left shoulder. No older than 20 summers, the dragon considered him. About the same time, the young man saw him and slowed, eyeing the stranger with caution. Now the trick was to get close enough so the human couldn't escape. With any luck, the old tales of dragon trickery had faded into legend, and he might score a feed. "Good evening to you," Dragon called in his friendliest voice. The young man halted a good measure away from him. "Good evening to you. I see you are a stranger here. What are you doing out at this hour?" "A stranger I am to these parts," the dragon lied. "I was on my way to the village for the night, but time got away from me and, well, here I am, still traveling with the snow falling about my head." "Indeed. Do you mean the village of Aden?" "Is that its name?" "Aye, it's the closest village, no more than a league from here. The other is Cambrook, but it is nigh 15 leagues away. You will be frozen by the time you reach it." "Are you going to Aden?" "Aye." "Perhaps I could travel with you to the outskirts where we could part ways," suggested Dragon, taking a closer step each time he spoke. Oblivious to the peril he was in, the youth relaxed his earlier caution. He was delectably near enough for the dragon to act. With the speed of a striking cobra, he flung out a clawed hand and latched around the other's arm. "Ah, foolish human," he said with disdain at the ease of his catch. "Did you not see in my eyes what I am?" "And what are you?" the young man yelled, struggling to be free, his eyes growing wide as he stared at the dragon. "Remember back to the old tales that spoke of me?" "No!" he yelled, tugging harder as recognition filled his terrified face. The dragon laughed in spite of the youth's fear and began to drag him struggling toward the edge of the path. Down at the stream he would feast on his tender young flesh. The youth continued to thrash and kick, but it did no good. The moonlight shone through the branches of the trees when the dragon stepped into something that bit into his flesh with metal teeth and held him fast, something that made a loud snap, slicing through his magic and redoubling to strike him with unimaginable pain. At once, it broke his hold on the young man, who broke free and took off running back to the village like a frightened hare. The dragon collapsed and clenched his teeth as fire bit into his leg, almost to the bone. "Ugh!" He pushed himself up a peg and stared in disbelief at the old, rusty wolf trap a hunter had once set and forgot. His blood trickled down from the row of metal teeth onto the frozen grass litter. He lay back down, the movement sending fresh fire racing through his mangled muscles and tendons. He screamed, almost blacking out. The deadly cuff dug deeper, the rusty teeth gnawed hungrily. He made an attempt to morph back into his dragon form, but the magic he'd relied upon all his life was now useless, and he struggled just to breathe. Desperation made him cry out again for help, but as the minutes stretched and his voice grew hoarse, he realized help might not come at all. Pure, unadulterated agony washed over him whenever he moved, and his screams became lost in the darkness that pressed around him. He hissed through his clenched teeth, Sweat dribbled down his brow, and the bleakness of hastening death crowded out the light from his eyes. His leg was burning up, and his vision swam with salty tears. He shut them tight. Then he sensed something moving through the brittle, frozen undergrowth. His eyes snapped open, hoping it wasn't a wolf or bear. He blinked. Someone stood there, a girl in a dark cloak. He forced his mind to concentrate. "Please," he whispered in a hoarse voice. "Help me." She hastened forward and peered at the trap. He noticed her grimace from what she saw, then she turned to face him. "When I open it, move your leg out." The dragon sensed her working, her cold fingers brushing against his skin, and then the sudden release brought an unexpected flood of blood and feeling rushing back into his leg, and more agony. With a loud scream, he dragged his foot out of the trap, which the girl snapped shut again. He writhed on the cold ground for several minutes while snowflakes fluttered down from a cold sky. The girl laid a cold hand on his to make him look at her. "I have some medicine which I'll apply to your leg. Sorry, it may hurt. Your leg is badly mangled, but I don't think it's broken. Hold still if you can." After she gently ripped open his leggings with a knife to reveal the wound and wiped the blood away, she unscrewed a small jar and applied a sticky ointment to the injury. He caught the scent of lavender and sensed soothing honey. The girl bandaged his leg with white cloth from her satchel and then set about making a fire to warm them. Exhausted, the dragon slept. For long hours, slumber held him in its embrace. The sound of someone humming prodded his eyelids to lift. A cold yellow sun glimmered overhead, and he realized it was morning. A flickering fire warmed him, but who was humming? He moved his head to look, and the humming stopped. A face appeared over the top of him, and he started. A human face. The girl's. It disturbed him that she was so near. Her soft, hazel eyes appeared kindly concerned, and her pecan brown hair was set in a single braid, which fell across her left shoulder and brushed against his neck. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he answered. "Have you water to drink?" She moved away and reappeared a moment later with a small container. She lifted his head with her hand so he could sip the cold water. All the while, he stared at her. "Have you been here all night, looking after me? Were you not afraid?" "You might have died had I not stayed," she said. "Wolves and bears hunt around here." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant, and I know what you are," she replied. He was surprised by her answer and her lack of fear. "And you aren't afraid?" "My grandmother told me about you, and no, I'm not afraid." "Why, then, did you save me?" "You were suffering, and I couldn't let you die in such a horrid way. It was wrong of the one who left his trap here. Besides, it's nearly Christmas, when we're supposed to show charitable deeds to those in need, just as the Christ child did long ago when he sacrificed himself for us." He snickered. "Not that you humans are very charitable to one another. You fight and curse over the slightest offense." Dragon never could understand humans. Still, this girl had shown him mercy, something he'd not experienced before, and now he began to sense the restorative magic returning, healing his leg. "I must get along now." Abruptly she rose as if she suspected as much and retrieved her satchel. "Who are you?" he asked. She giggled and shook her head. "Nay, you cannot have my name. Just call me the healer. Merry Christmas, dragon." With a light step up to the path, she hurried away. The dragon stared after her as she vanished along the road. The healer. He pondered that title and considered it a worthy one for the care she had given him. The dragon spent the rest of the old year inside his cavern, pondering the words and the kind face of the girl who had saved his life. Then he altered his form and walked as a human towards the village he knew so well. It was evening, and a chill was in the air when he spotted her carting water from the well. Almost at once, she saw him and placed the bucket down while he approached. Dragon halted a modest distance from her. "I'm impressed. Not even a limp," she said, indicating his leg. "Why have you come?" "Curiosity," Maybe. You spoke of Christmas as a charitable time, and I wished to impart a gift to you for the charity you showed me. The girl shook her head and giggled. There is no need. Your situation was different. Still, humor me. Hold out your hand. Nay, I am not that ignorant of dragon trickery to be— I give my word. No harm shall befall you. After a moment's hesitation, she reached out her hand. The dragon stepped forward and placed into it a small felt pouch. These are for you, he said, knowing that inside lay a sapphire, an emerald, and a diamond from his treasure trove, all worth a small fortune to elevate the girl and her family from their poverty. She did not thank him, and he appreciated that. He began to walk away when he caught the girl's surprised gasp and her subdued cry, and into the rising wind he whispered, A Merry Christmas to you too, healer.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Dragon Knights by Elizabeth Klein, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Elizabeth, go to elizabethkleinauthor.com to find more of her books, including some freebies. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. If you're enjoying listening to Finding Fantasy Reads, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help me know how to improve the show, whether it's to keep the things you like or get rid of the things you don't, and it helps new listeners find the podcast. A good review can often be the tipping point to get someone to listen or subscribe, which means I can keep making more new episodes for you. If you're not sure how to leave a review, check out today's show notes for some easy instructions. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.